Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And our first question, please.
Amy Lansdowne-Nassen. Does the panel see the votes of ordinary people in Oldham as more representative of Labour policy than the views of MPs in the party?
Labour took everyone by surprise yet again, voting substantially, getting a share of 62% of the vote, better than Labour did in May. Jane Collins, UKIP had a humiliating result.
Oh, I wouldn't go as far as to say humiliating.
What would be the word you would use?
Disappointing. It was disappointing. But I have to say that we've been accused of saying it was sour grapes. We've complained about the postal vote, etc. And there are two formal complaints as we speak this afternoon gone into the police, written witness statements regarding the postal vote fraud. And
alleged postal vote fraud being of what character?
Well, I haven't actually seen the actual written statement.
But what is the alleged fraud,
well,
as you see it?
On with the postal votes, the fact that the postal votes were not conducted in a democratic fashion. So until I see the witness statements, I can't possibly comment on what the witnesses have seen and heard. But yes, it was disappointing. But whenever we've got a situation where the postal vote is open to such misuse, we're never going to get a clear result in elections. So I think the whole voting system and the electoral system needs looking at, and unless you're infirm or cannot possibly get to a ballot box or away somewhere on holiday or working, then I think you shouldn't be allowed a postal vote. You should actually get yourselves to the polling station and put your ballot paper in the box yourself.
What do you make of what Nigel Farage said, in which it means that in some of these seats where people don't speak English, but they're signed up for postal votes, effectively the electoral process is now dead? What does that mean?
Maybe he means that they, with them not speaking English, maybe they don't read English either, so therefore they're going to have trouble filling in their postal votes. That could be interpreted in that way. But what I will tell you is that the demographics of Oldham are very similar to the demographics of Rotherham, where I stood in the last general election. And I was approached by two gentlemen who asked to see me outside the constituency, who gave me statements saying that they had actually filled in postal votes for other people. When they'd actually realised what they'd said to me, and they realised it was a criminal act, they panicked and said they wouldn't sign the statement. But they sat there in front of me and in front of two other people that were with me and admitted to filling in postal votes for other people.
This was the very first British election in which individual voter registration was fully enforced, designed to make it harder to create bogus voters. But a senior Labour figure around these parts has told me that for most elections in Oldham these days, Asian leaders do collect postal ballots en masse and in some cases fill them in for people. That's not illegal, but arguably it's against the guidelines.
So wherever we've got a system that allows this to happen, how can you possibly have a democratic election? You just can't.
May I just put one more thing to you from Nigel Farage? He spoke of some streets where no one speaks English. He said something not so very long ago about being on a train where he said no one spoke English. Some streets, how many streets? Do you have any idea?
No.
And no one in the street speaking English? Does he? Because you have to be very careful with that sort of thing, don't you, if you're speaking in public about very sensitive issues?
Jonathan, I didn't go down any streets in Oldham where there were no people that didn't speak English, but perhaps Nigel did, I don't know. But I think the point he's trying to make is that if you've got a postal vote system, if you can't speak English or read English, then somebody else is going to end up filling in your ballot paper. And I think that's probably what he's trying to say.
But I can't help thinking that if the majority had been about 1,000, then these allegations about postal vote fraud would have sounded significant. And all these words that I've kept hearing from UKIP spokespeople, not just from Jane, about how it calls into question the result, I think that's intended for an arena in which the majority was 1,000. Actually, the majority was enormous, and the percentage of the vote cast was 67%. So I don't think anybody can say the results in question.
No. I never questioned that Labour would hold the seat. And I think we all knew they probably would hold the seat. What we have questioned is the fact that when one of the postal vote ballot boxes was opened, the contents were 99.9% Labour. Now, that's a very big percentage by anybody's mark. And also, it did not reflect the actual voting in the polling stations. So, again, I'm drawing comparisons to the fact that when I stood in a by-election in Rotherham and I stood in the general election in Rotherham, with the actual polling station count, we were level pegging. When the postal votes came in, that made a very big difference, and significant wards made that difference.
Next, please.
Cal Bailey, what outcome to the climate change talks in Paris are you hoping for?
Jane Collins.
Well, no, I'm not particularly that hopeful. I think that we have to look at, are we talking about climate change or are we talking about man-made climate change? Because I have to say that I slightly, what is the difference between, climate change has been since time began. Climate has always changed, right? Man-made climate change is totally, if it exists, is totally different. So, and I have to say, Margaret, that I actually quite agree with your leader's brother, who was on the television the other evening, last night actually, and he suggests that the Earth is cooling, it is not warming, and he is actually a meteorologist, so he is qualified to pass an opinion where probably
he's a weather forecaster, and a very bad one.
Okay, George. Well, right, George, tell me this. Tell me this. Right, So he's a meteorologist, and you're saying he's got it all wrong, but that's fine. What I'm saying to you is the North Pole is supposed to be melting, yes? But then the South Pole is increasing in size. So there's two conflicting stories there. The other thing is we're told about all these different emissions, the CO2 and all the different gases, and we've had Mount Etna erupt today. Well, actually, what does that do to our climate change? So it's all very, very, very mixed up.
Well, hold it, George Monbiot. Margaret Beckett, former Environment Secretary, and also much engaged subsequently in the climate issues. You've been in this a long time. Are you an optimist about the Paris conference?
I'm much more optimistic than I've ever been before, because when I was doing all these negotiations, the United States, most of the time, was kicking and screaming and refusing to have anything to do with it. Today, the and countries like China and India were all saying, both China and India have done a lot, actually, on renewables and things of that kind. Oh. But they were saying, we aren't going to sign up to any targets. Because we think...
China and India are still building coal-fired power stations.
Yes, and China has just committed itself, as I recall, to a huge programme of investment in solar power, which will be bigger than the whole of their coal-fired capacity at present.
Margaret,
so can I just finish the sentence? So I'm hoping, I am more optimistic, because all of those big countries are gradually, very grudgingly in many cases, coming to accept that it is their responsibility too.
China, listen, Margaret, your knowledge of climate change, and it'll be something you've studied, it's not something I am a favourite. But what I can tell you for certain...
You have made that abundantly clear.
Yes, listen, I don't pretend to be something I aren't. What I'm saying to you is this. China's party in power will not jeopardise their economic growth at the cost of energy prices. No matter what they've committed to, they won't, because they know they will stay in power if they can guarantee industry and they can guarantee jobs. And we can't do that here. We are exporting industry and we are exporting jobs.
Jane, can I very quickly tell you something that you don't know, because it's never really had much publicity. Some years ago now, we, with China, did a study of what happens in China if you get anything like anywhere near 2 degrees of change. China will no longer be able to feed its people. The agricultural land it can use, the yield it can get from that land drops dramatically, and that's why China is doing stuff on renewables.
George Monbiot.
Well, while Jane floats into the stratosphere with the flying spaghetti monster, there are some of us who see...
Is that along with your squirrels
there are
George?
some of us who see climate change as a remarkably mild term for what we're facing. What we're looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is climate breakdown. Unless major action is taken, and major action which involves people all over the world. We can't keep on using China as an excuse for the things which our government doesn't want to do.
So do you agree with Prince Charles, then, that climate change has caused ISIS?
Oh, right.
Let George Monbiot continue.
We need to get some grip on reality here.
Wow.
George Monbiot.
Thank you, Jane, for that very pertinent observation.
Resistance can be applied as much to climate change as to terrorism. For now, the police can casually cycle through Paris, protecting the public with their pistols on their belts, just as we can, for now, build barrages against the rising seas. But in truth, today the centre of Paris is awash with some 6,000 police, armed with automatic rifles. That is what is really required to keep the terrorists at bay. But the French government is not alone in believing that if today's climate change conference fails, and global warming continues to displace ever more people from their homes, then no amount of police will be enough to keep the anger from our doors. France's development minister told me she is in no doubt.
On le voit bien, moi j'arrive du nord du Cameroun, l'extrême nord du Cameroun, là où Boko Haram est présent, et on voit que ce pays est à la fois frappé par le dérèglement climatique, donc la sécheresse, la faim, et en même temps, c'est là que des terroristes comme Boko Haram prennent naissance et peuvent se développer. Donc on voit bien que la question de la paix est liée à la question du climat.
Amid the floral tributes to Paris's loss, this summit, dramatically informed by these deaths from terrorism, recognizes at last that climate change is real, that humankind has exacerbated it and has to combat it, if upheaval and potential violence are not to dog the footsteps of our children and our children's children.
The fundamental problem that we've got in Paris at the moment is, number one, as Margaret says, the pledges don't add up to anywhere near the level of mitigation that we need to see. But number two, there is a deep flaw with the whole negotiations, which is that they are trying to stop us from using fossil fuels, but they're not trying to stop anyone from producing fossil fuels. In fact, our own government, in common with many others, has a commitment to try to get as much fossil fuel out of the ground. We actually have something called a legal obligation for maximum economic recovery of our oil and gas in this country. Well, that undermines all the climate change objectives. And it means that until you start dealing with the issue that coal, oil, gas are coming out of the ground as fast as ever before, and that when they come out of the ground they will be burnt, then that's going to just vitiate all the wonderful things which people are trying to do in terms of energy efficiency, energy conservation, the switch to renewables and all the rest of it. There has to be an agreement, and we have to start working towards this now, to leave that stuff in the ground. Otherwise, we really will cook. We really are going to see a situation where life on Earth becomes less and less pleasant for much of the world's population.
David Willits.
I very much agree with Margaret Beckett's assessment, and I do think that the scientific evidence that climate change is a real thing and is happening is overwhelming. But I would like to try to persuade Jane that even if she does not accept man-made climate change, she still has an interest, as we all do, in the success of this conference. So, for example, why are the Chinese engaged? One reason why the Chinese are engaged is when you've got that amount of coal-fired power stations, the air pollution, living in Beijing, any citizen of Beijing is breathing air that's the equivalent of smoking 40 cigarettes a day. We would like to have a cleaner atmosphere. This is the kind of area where countries can work together. There are going to be millions, billions of more people living in cities in the next decades. They can either be badly built, heavy energy users, producing lots of pollution, or they can be rather better built, with rather better investment in infrastructure, with more electricity and better insulated. Surely we all have an interest in that shift to urbanisation happening in a way that makes people's lives better. So this is worthwhile, even if you're in one of that small minority that doesn't accept.
Would you pick up, David?
What is the?
Can I just wanted to pick up.
What is the life expectancy of somebody living in Beijing?
I don't know. All I know is it's a pretty unhealthy place to be living
in Glasgow, because I can tell you, Beijing, they live longer.
Well,
let me pick up, if I could, David Willits, with you. Could I pick up the point that George Monbiot made?
Answer that,
hold on a moment, Jane, if you would.